and propose this other fourth model for language evolution. The first model I'm going to analyze and criticize is model number one, a very popular model, language as the result of adaptation and natural selection. I think there are major problems with this model anywhere, and this is the book that has just been shown. First edition 2010, and then in 2011 we have a reply to our many and bitter critics. You may not believe a word we say in this book, but I think you should believe some very distinguished biologists, some of the very best biologists in the field that say basically what we say. This is Greg Gibson, very distinguished geneticist, says that in a review published in Science in 2005 of a very nice book by Andreas, Wagner, Robustness and Evolvability in Living System, he says, this book contributes significantly to the emerging view that natural selection is just one and maybe not even the most fundamental source of biological order. Another, Lynch, biochemist, biologist, Indiana University, 2007, it is impossible to understand evolution purely in terms of natural selection, and many aspects of genomic, cellular, and developmental evolution can only be understood by invoking a negligible level of adaptive involvement. Another testimony by Eugene Koonin. Evolutionary genomic studies show that natural selection is only one of the forces that shape genome evolution and is not quantitatively dominant, whereas non-adaptive processes are much more prominent than previously suspected. I could go on. There are a number of other biologists that say this. But for the sake of the argument, let's ignore this. Okay? Imagine that indeed natural selection is the source of all biological traits and behaviors. I'm going to show you, even for the sake of the arguments granting that it cannot have been the case for language evolution. What are the most popular candidates in this approach? Well, motor control, communication, thought and conceptualization. These are the most popular candidates. Well, motor control, I think there is really very little plausibility to this. I'm just giving the most extreme case of a human being that has hardly any motor control. This is CF, a case that was examined by Giuseppe Cossu in Parma several years ago, and he has published this case, and he seen this boy when he was 13 years old. He's now in his early 30s. So this boy can only make two voluntary movements, which is eye movements and a movement with his neck like this. The only two movements he can make. He has to be strapped to a wheelchair, has been strapped to a wheelchair all his life. But his understanding of language was shown to be absolutely perfect. Moreover, they have created this nice contraption. So by this only movement that he can do, which is twisting his head to the right, he can select letters, and he can select words, and he can write. And I have read 2 or 3 pages of his dissertation at the University of Bologna in philosophy. He's a doctor in philosophy now, on the Bauhaus, the philosophy of the Bauhaus. You would never, ever imagine, you read those pages, you would never imagine that this is the author of those pages. So this is clear evidence against the very old suggestion that goes at least back to Jean Piaget and before, that language is an abstraction of motor control. There is no motor control here, no trial and error, and it cannot be the application of complex coordinated actions over time, fine-grained sequential behavior, and against the thesis that is some kind of skill, a motor skill, that language is out of motor skill. If this single case hasn't impressed you, well, then you have deaf signers, brain damage deaf signers. So you have left hemisphere damaged deaf signers, aphasics, show normal visual and spatial cognition outside the use of specialized syntax of American Sign Language, and right hemisphere damage non-aphasic signers display impaired visual and spatial cognition but their language, their sign language is absolutely perfect. You have the references here. So we have a double dissociation. Deficits in the apprehension of linguistic gesture do not transfer to the realm of non-linguistic gesture, communicative or not, and deficits in vision and spatial cognition do not transfer to the realm of the use of space for grammatical purpose. Number of further cases, lower appetito shown for the acquisition of personal pronouns in American Sign Language, babbling in American Sign Language from congenitally deaf children. So motor control is not needed, and even when it's fully present, cannot transfer to the realm of grammar, cannot transfer from the realm of grammar. What are the other darling candidates in this adaptationist approach? Well, communicability and thinking. So what we are going to see now is really some cases, just some cases, that whenever communicability and syntax compete, or whenever thought and syntax compete, syntax always wins and wins hands down. This is a very small selection of cases I'm going to present for reasons of time, but the real complete evidence is some 50 years and some 2,000 researchers in generative grammar, 100 languages and dialects examined, and also not just generative grammar. You have basically the same approach in lexical functional grammar, generalized phrase structure grammar, head-driven phrase structure grammar, which are sort of different schools than generative grammar. Not one case in all these decades of study, not one case in syntax has been solved by invoking communication or ease of communication. But let me show you that where you would expect it to work most, communication to dominate language, it doesn't. It's the other way, is syntax. So, ellipsis. You have part of a sentence that is not pronounced, is not omitted, is communicatively very expedient, less words, less efforts. It's considered redundant, something like, John should bring his maracas and Luigi should too. You don't say again, bring his maracas. Okay? You won't believe Peter, but you will Bob. And this challenges the idea that all you have is an economy of words, that you can omit a bunch of words. You cannot omit a bunch of words. You can only omit complete constituents. The only thing that can be omitted and deleted is something that must be recoverable, is something that is a complete constituent, complete syntactic constituents. So you can only omit the syntactic structure as a whole, not just a bunch of words. Moreover, in these cases, you can add things. So you would say, okay, I have omitted a number of words. Well, some of these words I'm going to bring them back. No, you can't do that. You cannot bring back those words. So John knows that Mary bought a book, but Fred doesn't. It's perfect. John knows that Mary bought a book, but Fred doesn't know that Mary is completely off. John wants to become a pilot, but his father doesn't. It's very clear. His father doesn't want to become a pilot. But then you add something, okay? You add explicit what is being a lie, that John wants to become a pilot, but his father doesn't want that. Now you have ambiguity. It can be that his father doesn't want himself to become a pilot, or you can interpret he doesn't want John to become a pilot. You can translate it into French, you can translate it into Italian, I don't know about Japanese, you have exactly the same thing. You add this, and something that wasn't ambiguous becomes ambiguous. So it's not just economy of communication. So adding words disrupts the syntax or creates ambiguity where there was none. So the elided structure is always understood to be there as a whole. And it has predictable causal manifestations. I'm not going to project the case assignment. There are examples, for instance, in German or in Russian, when something that is not there assigns case. So you have the first part has accusative case, a verb that assigns the accusative, you omit it, and then what is remained there, the who or the what, has accusative case. If the verb assigns dative, you have dative case. So it's something that isn't there assigns case. Okay. Now, another example where you expect more, code switching. Inserting fragments from one language in your discourse in another language. It has been studied extensively. And what you have there is that you cannot insert anything wherever you want. The central consideration is that although the motivation is quintessentially communication or communicative, well, you have to respect the syntax. You can only insert whatever is tolerated by, allowed by the syntax of the main language. You cannot insert, something that the syntax doesn't allow. You have strict syntactic constraints on what is possible. So code switching is rule governed, is syntax governed. These motivations cannot overcome syntax. In fact, nothing can overcome syntax. And syntax is autonomous with respect to motivation and social functions. So, for instance, you cannot have a switching between an NP, a noun phrase, and a modifier, an adjective, between a negation and the verb, between a verb and its auxiliary. There are plenty of things you cannot do in code switching. So there is no escape from syntax. Codes are switches only at points where the surface structures and the deep structures also of the two languages map onto one another. So the lesson from all this is, a number of other cases, but there is no escape from syntax. Conversational strategies, communicative intention, pragmatic requirements must bow to syntax. So communication cannot have been the selective factor. Motor control cannot be communication. What about thought, general, for the way we think? What about general schemata we apply to our understanding of what happens? Is this the source? Well, no, it doesn't seem to be. Because, look, there is a language universal which is called the verb-object constraint. The verb-object constraint is the following, is that a verb merges, unites with its object before it unites with the agent. Now, if you conceive of actions, we all, in the general conception of actions, the agent of the action is associated with the actions more intimately than the action is associated with its object, but not in syntax. In syntax, the situation is different. Mark Baker has examined this. He has a number of cases. It is really a language universal. It doesn't depend on the order, VSO, SVO, and so on and so forth. Easy to write formal languages where this doesn't happen, as the opposite happens. And from a purely conceptual point of view, the agent conceptually is associated with the action more intimately than the action is associated with its object. So you have a number of cases. For instance, in Mohawk, or in this Australian language, you have something like the baby meat ate. You combine the meat and the verb. You cannot have baby ate. You cannot combine the subject baby ate and then the meat. In other languages, you have something like bread cut with a knife. You can put together bread and cut, or you can put together knife cut, but you cannot have, he cut bread with a knife. And you have idioms in all languages. All the idioms in all languages, they have the verb and the object. And the subject is free to be whatever it is. You don't have idiom in which you have the subject and the verb and the object is whatever it is. There are very few cases where it seems to be like that, but you analyze them better, it's not like that. Then, this is another interesting thing, number of works, 4 volumes now on what is called the left periphery, which is, the syntactic structure. If you look at the sentence, it's the top of the sentence towards your left. You have, I won't go into the details of this, you have all this very complicated hierarchy. So not all sentences have all this, but when a sentence has a number of these, that's the way the hierarchy works. So, for instance, I have an example in Italian, an example in English. He used to be inclined to want to stop. It's okay. He used to be inclined to want to stop. He was inclined to use to want to stop. It's completely out. So, a number of data that confirm this hierarchy. You have had movement, restructuring, verbs, clitic climbing, and so on and so forth. There are a number of data in many, many languages. Now, what is so curious about this? For instance, habitual dominates volitional. Isn't that strange that habitual dominates volitional? That irrealis dominates alethic, logical necessity, possibility, or impossibility, and so on, and so on, and so on. Okay? So thought, this is not the way we think. It is the way we speak, but it's not the way we think in the abstract. It's very bizarre, this dominance relation. So we could have no hierarchy, and we could have a different hierarchy. We could communicate equally well. Now, let me give you another, I think, very interesting, quite damaging to the idea that thought is what inspires language, is the conservativity of determiners. A lot of work on the conservativity of determiners. I am in a very good company in having inquired about this. So what is the conservativity of determiners? Well, the arguments of natural language determiners, they have to be ordered, okay? So you have a specific order. So the Tuscans are Italians, it's true. What is not true is that the Italians are Tuscans, so you cannot invert the arguments of a determiner like the, or determinants like most, all, and so on and so forth. They have to have that order. So, very simple example. All men are mortal, man, is the same as saying all men are mortal is the same as saying all men are mortal, man. And Jim Higginbotham tells me that this is already found in William of Sherwood. All children like ice cream is the same as saying all children are ice cream lovers that are children. Most Basque are Spaniards is the same as saying most Basque are Basque Spaniards, and so on and so forth. So you have scope and restriction, and one is the restriction, the other is the scope. And the general relation between sets that you have, a conservative relation, you have a relation with set A and set B, and this is the same, if it is a conservative relation, is exactly the same as the relation between this set and the intersection of the two sets. Okay? All Tuscans are Italian, all Tuscans are Tuscan Italians. Now, we can invent non-conservative determiners. You know, this is one example I do to Juan Uriaguereca. Imagine, troll sharks eat fish. It would be the same thing as saying troll fish are fish that sharks eat. Instead of all sharks eat fish is the same as all sharks are sharks that eat fish. This impossible determiner would be non-conservative. We can think like this with paper and pencil. We can create imaginary determiners in any way we want. They are non-conservative determiners. No child will learn it. No language you find such determiners. So they are very easy for thought. Okay? So non-conservative relations are ubiquitous. Even in games, for instance, very simply, the relation of A trumps B. You have this relation of 4 of a kind, trump full house. Then you take the intersection, and you have this relation, which is also true, but is not the same relation. So you have something which is asymmetric, transitive, but not conservative. Just a simple case of something which is asymmetric, transitive, not conservative. So how frequent are conservative relations between sets? Well, the calculation has been done by Keenan and Stavy. You have about 8 in 1,000. So the percentage of conservative relations between sets is less than 1%. But this is a language universal, although this is a very rare kind of relation between sets. All determiners of all languages have this relation, which is in the order of abstract possibilities less than 1%. So we have a universal, which concern a key relation between sets. The most elementary thing you can see, sets and relation between sets. How can something be more elementary in thought than sets and relation between sets? And what all languages have taken for all their determiners is something which is less than 1% of all conceivable relation between sets. Okay? Is it too hard for thought? No, it's not too hard for thought. I just gave you an example. I can give you 25 other examples. You can easily think about non-conservative determiners. It takes a little bit of paper and pencil, but it's something we can think about without any problem. They would be unlearnable by the child, not because the child is stupid, but because the child is a human being, and they can only learn something which is in the domain of natural languages for humans. You have no way of explaining this, I assure you, with logical, standard predicate argument, laws of thought, psychology of reasoning, even less so, pragmatic constraints, communication, cultural habits, and this sort of thing. There is no hope you can explain this universal of language. And I won't go into the detail. There is an explanation in syntax. There are various factors that have been examined, and these are exquisitely syntactic factors that explain that. So none of the selective pressures for the evolution of language as an adaptation we have seen, communication, motor control, culture, and so on and so forth, can begin to explain the core of language. Well, model number 2. Okay, forget communication, forget pure thought. You know, we have other cognitive things. So what is a critique of this? You know, all double dissociations between language and cognition, of which there are many. Okay? So let me just give you a few of these. The famous case, Susan Curtis has studied, and then she has recently written summaries about this. So Genie, you know, this poor girl who was, you know, kept sequestered, you know, for a year until she was, you know, 9 years old. Excellent vocabulary learning, good ability to initiate and sustain topics, excellent ability to apprehend complex hierarchical structures outside the realm of grammar, good ability to logically sequence pictures, and so on and so forth, bafflingly powerful non-verbal communicative ability, superior visual and spatial cognition, but severely limited grammar, lacked functional structure, all the INC system functional elements completely absent, and then cannot have this fundamental syntactic operation called move. Many more cases, you know, women, girls with Turner syndrome, they only have one X chromosome. They have pervasive non-language perceptual and cognitive deficits, you know, studied by Susan Curtis, Yamada, and others. And the mirror image is boys with Klinefelter syndrome, a XXY chromosome, normal conversational abilities, several specific language disorders, for instance, binding and control, presupposition and entailment, object class. Double dissociation. In a number of others, double dissociation cases, you know, a number of them. So you also have a neural distinctiveness, distinct columns of neurons or neural tissues in the cortex. You may have heard this already in this thing. Different from those that respond to acoustic distinctions. And then you can have manipulation that have acoustic signals that the outlier is distinct acoustically, or it may not be phonological. You have an outlier which is an outlier phonologically, but not acoustically, so you have a dissociation even between sounds and phonology. How soon does it happen? Very soon. It happens very soon. You know, 3-month-old, you know, have been tested. And these specificity of the different sensitivity of different brain areas are present, you know, before the onset of speech production. How fast is this? It's very fast. The discrimination is very fast. The early time window is very narrow and robustly present, you know, of an index of automatic syntactic processing. So it's a modular response. So summing up, the modularity of language makes no doubt. The micromodularity of language, modules inside language, I think that Stefano Kappa may have already, you know, given a lecture that, you know, the modularity inside language also makes no doubt. It cannot be the case that language is an application of general intelligence, that cognitive structure percolate, transfer, migrate, apply to language. Okay, model number 3, learnability and statistics. Here I can only give you the flavor of this because it immediately becomes quite technical. The idea, for instance, you know, we have selected 2 of these cases, the Reali and Christensen, 2003 and 2005. The idea that you have bigrams, you know, pairs of words, the statistics of pairs of words that can explain a number of syntactic phenomena by pure statistics. And another paper that has made a lot of splash, Perforce, Tannenbaum, and Regiers, domain general capacities, Bayesian analysis, and they claim that all the child needs to learn syntax is this domain general capacity without having, quote unquote, without having this knowledge innately specified as part of the language faculty. Now here are 3 papers, one of which I'm a co-author, that, you know, have analyzed this in detail. All the statistics have also analyze computer programs that are the kind of computer program that these authors have suggested, and it doesn't work. It really, their thing doesn't work when you do it, it's really out. So the punchline of this critique is that low-level statistics over word strings may be of some use, but cannot substitute for syntactic knowledge. Then the only route, and it has been shown with computer simulation, is that you have local syntactic dependencies, that you have dependencies over phrase structures which do not have a physical manifestation or an acoustic manifestation, and at a minimum the child must have this accessible to explain how the child can get to the syntax the way it gets, as it was proposed many, many years ago. Okay, so these models don't work. What now? Well, what do we have in mind? What do we suggest, rather? Probably minor modifications in gene regulation, not driven by functional demands for the reason I have just explained, not the result of adaptation and natural selection, and then modifications in one or more developmental modules with an impact on brain structure and function. Now, are we appealing to miracles? This is the usual critique. Okay, well, you're appealing miracles. No, we are not appealing to miracles, and let me show you a case as a representative case. What would you say about the following? Perfectly formed globular eyes, capable in the abstract of forming detailed images, no brain to receive these images, no optic nerve, and the focal distance of the lens that goes behind the retina. Okay? And then you have other details that make these eyes, these globular eyes, very similar to what we have in vertebrates. A lot of structure without any function. And this is the creature that has, these are called rhopalia. You see them here, 4 rhopalia, each containing 4 globular eyes with no brain, nothing to form images. They are sensitive to light and to darkness, but hundreds of other species of jellyfish have much, much more rudimental organs. So you have all this structure without function. Is this mysterious? It's not so mysterious. It's a very nice, it's a perfect case of evo-devo. Cedric yesterday presented rightly this evo-devo. So this is what you have. You have a perfect, globular eyes. You have eyes at 90 degrees. Very nice. Wouldn't it be nice to have us? We had eyes at 90 degrees. We could see what happens there. But we don't have. They have them, and they have no brain to use them. So considerable conservation of regulatory genes, and so there is a lot of overlap. And this is a story which is a very nice evo-devo story. There are no mysteries here. What has happened, I won't go into the detail, but what has happened from you have a duplication of an ancestral gene, and then you have a duplication of the duplication, and the biochemistry and the gene regulation is perfectly well explained by these authors. So it's not mysterious why these creatures have these eyes. You have a genetic explanation, and what is interesting is that there is a lot of genetic, developmental similarity, perhaps even more than similarity, between the eyes, the globular eyes in these creatures and the globular eyes in a mouse, in a giraffe, or in us. They didn't expect this to happen. It was a discovery. They have discovered that. The genetics of the system is not mysterious. The genetics of the system has been explained. So you have the activation of developmental module, you have a duplication of genes, and you have all this structure that has no function, but is there, and is not a miracle. It's not mysterious. It's very interesting. It's curious and interesting, but not miraculous and not inexplicable. So the lessons from this case, I think there are 3 of them. That relatively simple genetic changes explain major morphological changes in novelty. High conservation of the gene complexes and the gene regulatory system. Changes not driven by function. Changes not driven by adaptiveness. Though, of course, they are compatible. These creatures can survive very well with all these eyes. They are not very useful, but, they can survive and reproduce. The modularity of genes and development. And also that once you activate a module, there are other examples. Cedric has shown other examples, insects, all these complicated horns of insects. Once you activate a developmental module, it may well go all the way up not stop in between. And this is regardless of utility. Okay? So very ancient dormant genes can be duplicated and then activated, of which there's a number of examples in the evo-devo literature. You know, my friend Alessandro Minelli has published it, you know, and other authors as well, you know. So, what now? Certainly crucial steps in the evolution of language at the very minimum have been the lexicon, unlimited recursion, the binary branching and X-bar structure, syntactic movement, internal merge, and the interaction with the interfaces. Now, yesterday I have shown, I think I have, make it plausible, that these two come from physics. You don't have to have an evolutionary adaptive story because they come from physics. Once you have a system capable of doing this, why you have this X-bar structure, why you have binary branching, is principles of optimal computation. Well, what about the lexicon? Look, the lexicon, you know, we have heard this morning about symbols. Well, words are symbols in a sense, but they are so special symbols because unlike any other symbols, they must possess at the very least these four characteristics: a spectral reference, headedness, internal structure, and edge features. So very briefly, a spectral reference, you know, it is something that, you know, buy and sell. Whenever you have an act of buying, you have an act of selling, and this is the way we look at it, whether we describe it as buying versus selling. Whenever you have some creature fleeing, you have another creature chasing. You may make a little movie. The movie is the same for buy and sell. The movie is the same between flee and chase, but these are aspects, a spectral reference. And all the words in our language, in every language, all the words in our lexicon have this spectral reference that symbols have not. You know, the cries and the signals, vervet monkeys, you know, making a cry for a leopard, which is different from the cry for a snake, they don't have a spectral reference. And then you have headedness, the head-complement relation, which is conserved throughout the syntactic derivation. You have this headedness that symbols usually don't have. And then you have a lot of internal structure, really a lot. You have all the thematic roles. You have the hierarchy, internal hierarchy. Let me give you some example derived from studies by Anna Maria Di Sciullo. You have this headedness is preserved throughout the derivation, and you have all of these structure, even for something as simple as this, you know, who versus what. Very simple, tiny little words, they have this internal structure. And more internal structure. For more complicated words, you have to have all this internal structure with interesting differences, parametric variation, anyway, differences between different languages and how they can combine. You have an internal hierarchy. Very simple examples I'm taking from Anna Maria. You have valuable, invaluable. You don't have value inable. Okay? So whenever you have something like this, invaluable, it means it's impossible to give value to it. You don't have any word that is, say, possible not to. So inedible means impossible to eat. You don't have possible not to eat. So they are offering, you know, a reception. They don't tell you, oh, we have inedible things for you. It means you can eat them if you want. If you don't want, you cannot eat them. You know, it's a very simple thought. But it cannot be a word because negation dominates everything else. You cannot have negation saying possible not to. A number of other examples. So you have negation dominates modality, and you have different modality. It cannot be the case that modality. So you have enlarged, you have re-enlarged, but you cannot have in-re-larged. In French, you have re-largened. You cannot have that. So you have aspect dominates modality, aspect 1 dominates aspect 2, dominates modality, with some interesting difference between the different languages. Possible not to is a very simple concept, an impossible word, an impossible word. And then you have this rather complicated, fundamental, called edge features. So you have mergeability. You have things that are put together and they have a valency. As in chemistry, you have, you know, valency, and this valency percolates all the way up. So you have some detail. I won't go into all these details, but you have operator features that C-command asymmetrically as spectral features, and then you have semantic relations, predicate, argument, aspect, and operator variable relations between affixes and roots are derived in the morphology and are legible at the interface with the cognitive interpretive thing. Very complicated. This is the lexicon. The lexicon is this. It's not a bunch of symbols. It is a bunch of symbols that have all these properties. And in fact, Mark Hauser, in a volume that Juan Viragareka and I edited, says, quote unquote, there is nothing remotely resembling words in animal communication. And he knows. He's the author of a big volume of some years back on called Animal Communication. There is nothing remotely resembling words in animal communication. They have symbols and cries and things like that, nothing remotely resembling words. Okay, so how did we get all this? How did we get? Well, you know, some event that is much more limited than what we have seen for all the eyes of the jellyfish, of that species of jellyfish. Some minor gene rearrangement, minor shifts in gene regulation that has impacted brain organization, probably only minimally. So why do I call this model 1/2? Because I can't tell you which genes have done what. In the years to come, I'm sure, you know, somebody will discover them. You know, the younger people here probably will see that. But at the time, don't ask me because nobody knows about that. So the future will tell us. What if something, you know, like the appearance of the Rhopalia happened in our species? And it did find a function. It did interact with function. It is not like the case of the Rhopalia that have no function, no brain. We have a brain. We have, you know, all the apparatus. So a small mutation like that, you know, has found a very fertile thing to give all these things that we know are part of language. It did find the function, and it did interface with pre-existing structures, conceptual structures, motor structures that were already there. So let me give you one example. I like this example because Steve Wilson is a colleague in my university. This was published a few months ago. It's a very nice example. Let me give, I'm not telling you this is the explanation, but just to give you the flavor of what one discovers. So they have done multimodal imaging approach, you know, then, you know, the diffusion tensor imaging, voxel-based morphometry, functional MRI, a bunch of these things, okay? So you have a dorsal and a ventral language pathway linking frontal and temporal language regions, and they have distinct roles. Only the dorsal pathways, I'll show you that in a moment in an image, the SLF and arcuate plays a critical role in syntactic processing. Only that one plays a critical role in syntactic processing. Syntactic deficits and functional abnormalities related to syntactic processing in primary progressive aphasia. They have studied primary progressive aphasia, which is not traumatic in the sense. It's something that happens over time. They are specialists at the University of Arizona on primary progressive aphasia. It may reflect not only gray matter damage, but also disruption of communication between frontal and temporal language regions, specifically via the dorsal pathway. So you have these different connections between, you know, approximately Broca's and Wernicke's. You have these different things. And you have different manifestations of lesions, even small lesions, to respectively each one of these. Lesions in these, there are two pathways here in reality, compromise syntax. Lesions here don't compromise syntax, but they compromise other things, you know, number of words that you can remember, this sort of thing. So for instance, here you have 3 different patients. Here you have a non-fluent patient. Here you have a semantic problem with this patient. And here you have a logopenic, you know, very few words. And you see, you know, the different configurations of these different connecting things. Now, what is interesting is the following. A recent comparative diffusion tensor imaging study reported that the arcuate branch of the superior longitudinal fascicles, what you have seen in the image, is indeed strongly modified in humans relative to non-human primates. We have found one thing. I'm not telling this is the key, this is all we need, but these kind of studies, of which there will be more and more and more, can give us keys one day to explaining, humans relative to non-human primates. It projects much more density to posterior temporal cortex than it does in macaques or chimpanzees, especially in the left hemisphere. So, a lesson from evo-devo and modularity, that it may be quite illuminating also to study distant species, distant from us, in which the same developmental modules have been activated. So songbirds are interesting. There was early in this room an interesting kind of experiments on songbirds. They may be even more interesting than primates, not because we have recent ancestors in common. We do not derive from birds. They are not our close relatives. But something has been activated in songbirds that allows them to have these very complicated songs, to learn songs, to variate the songs. Some species have one song for the rest of their life. Other species have a different song every season. They acquire a different song. So it is a very interesting case. We do not share ancestors with them. And this is Bob Berwick's Big Bang. I like it. There was, you projected a similar slide yesterday. So, birds have rhythm and vocal learning. Chimps are smart creatures. They got categories, And then, these two things may have combined in us for the first time. And so we get both, and we got merged, and we got the lexicon, and we got all that. I'm not telling you, Bob Berwick doesn't claim that's it. Believe us, that's what happened. But it gives us an idea of an approach to language evolution which is different. Activation of a module, activation of another module, and in other species all you have. That module has been activated, and in another species that module has been activated, and then both modules have been activated with a number of interesting consequences. Now, this is a very distinguished evolutionary biologist, Leonard Krugliak, professor of ecology and evolutionary biology at Princeton, so we should listen to him. He knows what he's talking about. Now, this is a paper published in Nature. It is about complex diseases. Because diseases are interesting, you want to treat people, understanding that where the money is. But a complex disease is a complex biological trait. So this refers to complex biological traits. What does Leonard Krugliak say? It is a possibility that there is something we just don't fundamentally understand that is so different from what we are thinking about that we are not thinking about it yet. God bless him. God bless him. And I stop here.